It started with something simple, so small that most people might not have noticed. But Daniel was the kind of person who noticed things. His house was old, inherited from his grandparents, full of creaks and groans that whispered in the night. The basement had always been there, unchanged for decades, with its concrete floor, wooden shelves stacked with forgotten relics, and a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. But then, one evening, Daniel noticed something that shouldn't have been there. A door. It was set into the far wall, where before there had been nothing but cold, gray concrete. The wood was dark and polished, almost new, with an ornate brass handle that gleamed in the dim light. His first instinct was to think he had simply forgotten it. But no, that was impossible. He had lived here for years. He knew every inch of the house. And yet, here it was. The air around the door felt wrong, heavy, as if the space itself had thickened, warping reality just enough to make his skin prickle. Daniel hesitated, staring at it. His heartbeat quickened. He reached out, fingers brushing the brass handle. It was cool to the touch. Something in his mind screamed at him to leave it alone. But curiosity was a powerful thing. With a deep breath, he turned the knob and pulled the door open. Behind the door was a staircase, stretching downward into darkness. A shiver ran down his spine. He had expected another storage room, maybe an old wine cellar, something practical, something that made sense. But this staircase was unnatural. The steps were made of smooth, polished stone, worn as if they had been used for centuries. The walls were lined with old brick, damp with moisture. A musty, earth-like smell filled the air. The dim light from the basement barely reached past the first few steps, swallowed by an abyss below. Daniel hesitated before stepping inside. He listened. Silence, an impossible silence, the kind that made his ears ring. He took a step down, then another. The air grew colder. After descending what felt like 10, maybe 15 steps, he glanced back up toward the basement. The open door was still there, the warm glow of his house spilling into the stairwell. Relief washed over him. He continued downward. The staircase twisted and turned, leading deeper than any normal basement should. He checked his watch. 5 minutes had passed. 10. That was when he realized something was wrong. No matter how far he walked, the stairs didn't end. At first he thought he was just imagining it. Maybe it only felt longer than it really was. Maybe he was getting turned around in circles. He stopped and turned back. The stairs behind him stretched endlessly upward, vanishing into darkness. His breath caught in his throat. The basement door was gone. Panic set in. He started running up the stairs, his footsteps echoing through the suffocating silence. He climbed, heart pounding, lungs burning. But there was no exit. The harder he ran, the farther the top seemed to stretch away from him. He stopped, gasping. His legs trembled. His fingers clutched the cold stone wall as dizziness threatened to overtake him. This was impossible. He pulled out his phone, hands shaking. No signal. The battery indicator flickered, then died, though it had been nearly full when he left his house. The darkness around him seemed to thicken. Then he heard it. A whisper. Not a voice, not quite. More like the rustling of wind through dead leaves. A sound that carried no source, no direction. Something was watching him. Daniel pressed himself against the wall, his breath shallow. The whispering grew louder, shifting, moving. Shapes flickered in the corners of his vision. Shadows, not cast by any light, but moving on their own, slipping along the walls and steps like ink in water. He closed his eyes. This isn't real. This isn't real. When he opened them again, the shadows were closer. A cold, creeping dread coiled in his stomach. He had to move. Staying still felt like an invitation. He turned and ran downward, step after step, deeper and deeper, his footfalls echoing through the suffocating void. The air grew damp, thick with an unfamiliar scent, earthy, decayed. The whispering turned into something worse, a breath, right behind him. He spun around. Nothing. And yet the darkness shifted like something had just moved out of sight. Daniel's mind screamed at him to wake up, to leave, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped in a space that shouldn't exist, running in circles in a nightmare that had no end. His legs ached, his body trembled. He didn't know how long he had been descending. Minutes, hours. Time had lost meaning. And then, he saw it. A doorway. It stood at the bottom of the steps, barely visible through the suffocating gloom. His heart leapt. A way out. Daniel sprinted toward the door. His hand slammed against the wood, pushing it open. The moment he stepped through, he stumbled. His feet hit concrete. He was in a basement, but not his basement. The room was identical. Same shelves, same flickering bulb. But something was wrong. The air felt heavier, the silence more absolute. And then, he saw it. The door. It was right where it had been before, as if he had never opened it at all. His breath came in ragged gasps. He turned, searching for anything different, anything that could prove he was somewhere else. Then, a shadow moved, not his own. It stood near the far wall, shifting, stretching unnaturally, watching. The whispering started again. A realization struck him, cold and paralyzing. He was back where he started. Or maybe he had never left. The whispering grew louder. The shadows slithered closer. The basement door was still open behind him, leading to the stairs. And deep, deep down, far beyond where he had ever reached, something was still waiting. Waiting for him to come back, waiting for him to descend again. And this time, he wouldn't escape.